a good basis to work from, because these are the complete unabridged guidelines, as it were. So they number some 12 pages. There are 5 parts, an overview of the scheme itself, and then 3 templates, one for pre-observation meetings, the observation session itself, and then a post-observation action plan at the end. And then there are some further readings. Now, these guidelines are suitable for a range of different learning activities. They don't require you to necessarily review an entire module taught online in the VLE. It might be a review of a particular topic or a week. It might be an element. It could be a particular discussion forum or a wiki, or it might be a single webinar, or indeed possibly a pre-recorded video or podcast. So the idea of using these particular guidelines at different levels is something which we do encourage you to do. So it provides something of a consistent approach regardless of the granularity, if you like, of the element that you're actually looking at in the context of the learning and teaching. So the first of the proformas is a pre-observation meeting. It follows exactly the same pattern as the in-class or teaching that proformas that you've seen perhaps before in terms of other peer observation schemes. It basically allows you to define what it is you as the observee are hoping to achieve from the session itself. So I think it's useful to spend some time working out what you want the observer to look for. And this is where this is a developmental process. These are not, in fact, guidelines to be used for a management approach. If it isn't a management observation, clearly you should be informed in advance what it is the management observation is there to try and identify. But these guidelines are specifically available for developmental purposes. So you might actually identify one very, very specific aspect of your practice which you want the observer to try and support you with. The online observation itself, regardless of whether it's, as I said, a single video or might be an entire module, requires some structure in terms of the observation. You could just have someone write you a short narrative report, but I think that being guided by specific questions makes a lot of sense. So literally things like, were the outcomes of that particular learning activity identified up front? Is the structure clear? All those kinds of questions help provide a context for the commentary that the observer is going to provide. In an online context where we aren't necessarily physically present, we aren't physically be able to be seen by students necessarily all the time. They can't read our body language, they can't read each other's body languages, look at other students in the classroom and get a sense of where other people are going within the learning journey, as it were. It's important to try and pay some attention to the delivery, the pace, the content. There are a number of different dimensions to the learning experience which really do come out in the online environment. So whether you've rushed an activity, for example, is something that it's often very difficult as the person teaching to really get that sense. You don't necessarily get that feedback back from your individual students as to whether in fact they're being overly rushed through an activity, but someone observing, given perhaps, particularly if they're observing asynchronously, so if they're watching a recording of a webinar, for example, or they're reading back your comments and your responses to an online forum, they have much better sense, the observer often has a better sense of whether in fact an activity may actually have been well paced. It's also very important to ensure that learning is engaging and motivating, and using media in an online environment is one way of doing that, but choosing the right kind of media, things that are relevant, that generally have a learning message, is also an important part of the observational process. Someone who's observing might say, that particular example, that particular video that you showed, or that particular media that you directed students to watch was really perhaps a little bit too long. You might want to have edited it down and so on. So having that level of independent observation is invaluable. Ensuring that students are engaged and motivated requires a degree of managing their participation. So what opportunities were given to students in order to get them to participate? It might be polls, it might be having breakout groups in a webinar or in a discussion forum. Are the questions that are being given to students, are they being well phrased? Are they genuinely using active language to try and engage the learning, engage with the question in mind? It's important to try and make sure that the visual resources that you're using to stimulate learning are appropriately chosen. So do you actually have the skills to design those materials yourself, or have you acquired them from some other source? If you have downloaded resources, are you properly attributing them in terms of their copyright and so on? But the use of learning resources out from an observer's perspective is to see whether or not it supported the learning activity itself, whether they have been well structured, well introduced, whether they are contextualized to the learning. That's the important part of the learning message itself. An observer may also be able to make some useful comments on your use of the technology, your ability perhaps to italicize within a discussion forum in terms of your response, or different, or to use a poll within your webinar. But they will obviously only be able to base that on things they've observed or things within their own practice. So they might actually make a comment on what they've seen you do that they want to borrow from. So you may find that they're complementary in terms of their use of the online learning context, because everybody's actually learning as we go. How smoothly you use the environment, how capable you are at switching environments or switching views, or moving posts or deleting posts online, or how it is you use the physical technical environment itself, will obviously affect your style, the way that your learning style, your teaching style is perceived by students. So don't take it too harshly if people do respond with more queries about what you've done in the environment than perhaps they would do in a face-to-face classroom, because again, all of us are working in a relatively novel environment. But a lot of the issues around style are really about your ability to convey enthusiasm, whether you can be clear, whether you can engage students appropriately during an online environment. So in a webinar situation, for example, are you able to listen and to deliver your teaching, listening to any verbal comments being made, but are you able to keep track of what's going on in the chat room, for example? Or on a discussion forum, are you able to identify those posts which are definitely changing the whole tone of the conversation, to highlight them, to try and pull out the salient messages from them? So that all becomes part of your learning and teaching style in an online environment. It's then important, I think, to provide a summary for the observer to actually be able to identify some key strengths in your delivery, and for you to then take particular attention to those. This then allows you to develop some actions for yourself as the observee, and for the observer to do the same thing for themselves. So there are two elements to this third proforma. One is the observee reflections, identifying specifically things that they thought were successful, areas for development and so on. And an observer reflections, which also identifies particular elements of this particular delivery environment or particular activity that the observer might want to take as part of their own learning from having done this observation. And the final part of the guidelines provides some further reading to support the entire process, and you are encouraged to try and look up some of these resources. Any of them would be of some interest to you, but obviously if you're going to become a formal observer within the context of your school, or you deem this to be an important part of your own development as an online practitioner, these are all very relevant readings.